Okay, take three, and this time I'm not gonna hit stop recording on accident. Holy God. Okay, boom. Slow play video. What is it, and how do you avoid it in your games? This is honestly good because it lets me formulate my thoughts. So, slow playing in UniVersus. What is it? Why do people do it? Why do people do it when they don't even think they're doing it? I've got a snail here, very slow animals, or so I've been told. And I've got the Hill twins, Eric and Eon Hill. This is a joke for like 5 people, and I explained it the first 2 attempts at recording this. I'm not going to this time. Boom! What even are the time rules in this game? Essentially, once time is called, the second player in the game gets the last turn, and if no one's dead, it's a draw. How that what to explain that a little more in case you're not familiar. In every Swiss round, you have 60 minutes to finish your match. So let's say you're going into game 3 and you're going first. It is your turn, and time is called. You finish your turn, your opponent finishes their turn, and then the game ends. And if no one is dead, the game is declared a draw. Alternatively, if your turn takes, or before the second player's end of turn, if the 10 minutes of overtime finish up, you finish the current form, and then the game ends. And if no one's dead, it's a draw. This Some people are like, man, there should be like a tiebreaker system. I personally like this. That's kind of a personal preference thing. Whatever. I also don't really get to deal with this very much. I've had very few draws in my competitive UniVersus experience that weren't intentional. Um, this is important to know about for what the rest of this video is going to be. So let's talk about slow playing in the rules. If you look in the UVS UniVersus floor rules document, slow play is defined as a term where a player isn't playing the game at a reasonable pace to give themselves an advantage with the round timer. In other games, this is referred to as intentional slow play. Um, so imagine, let's say I'm an intentional slow player, and I'm in a match of UniVersus. We're playing our game, and game one takes 45 minutes, and we're both playing at an acceptable pace. Game one takes 45 minutes. It's just weird. Like, it's like Mothra versus Rodan or whatever. It's a long game. And so I'm going second now in this game because I've won game one in 45 minutes. And my opponent, so now that this happens and I look over, I see there's 15 minutes on the clock. I'm like, all right, I need to sideboard. I look at my sideboard. And I'm like, this is not easy. I don't have any sideboard cards in my sideboard for Rodan. I'm like, 2-3 minutes pass, and I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm not going to sideboard. And so we go to our game, and then I look at my hand, and I'm like, ooh, what do I want to mulligan? What do I want to mulligan? And then I say, you know what? I'll put back 2 cards. Then I shuffle, and 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 I shuffle. I draw my new cards. Or not in that order. That's not how it works. But whatever, you get the idea. And then, my opponent builds out. I go to my turn. I'm like, ooh, what do I review? What do I review? I review and I draw. And I'm like, ooh, what do I build? What do I build? And I take my build turn. I look at their discard pile maybe, and then I build. I'm like, should I play this extra card in my hand? Should I try to play this Foundation on 5? I'm just going to pass. And it goes to their turn, and they play an attack. They say, any responses? And I'm like, ooh. And I look at my board, and I look at my hand, and I look at their discard pile, and I look at my discard pile. I'm like, no responses. And they play an enhance, and I'm like, ooh, let me think. You get the idea. And then, basically, if you're playing like that, once the first attack resolves, we've gone from 15 minutes left on the timer to maybe like 6. And that's not how this game should work. That's ridiculous. But you're doing this so that your opponent finishes their turn too, and you're 1-0, and you draw, and you've got like 3 minutes left on the clock. And you can say, oh, well, I end my turn, I win 1-0. That's cheating. That's super cheating. That is what would be called intentional slow play. And if you see your opponent doing this, you should pretty much instantly say, hey, judge, I think if you ever catch somebody and you think you're like pretty confident they're maliciously slow playing you, I would just instantly call it judge. I don't think there's really much to, I think when it comes to the other type of slow play we'll be talking about, I can understand if you're like, well, I want to, I'll just say something and be like, hey, please play faster. when it comes to malicious intentional slow play, I don't think there's any reason to give this guy the benefit of the doubt. I would just be like, hey man, I want to call a judge, and I would say judge. Um, and Yeah, that's pretty much where intentional slow play is at in this game. For what it's worth, I've been playing this game for like I think like a year and a half, and I have not had any issues with intentional slow play. There are times in this game where you might, it's your turn. You are going second. It is your turn, and you see there's 3 minutes left on the clock, and you might take a line of play that's like not optimal in order to use more time. But as long as you're playing at a reasonable pace, that is allowed. That is allowed. If you're like, well, I've got 4 attacks in my hand. Realistically, if I play them all and I check like 2 threes, I'm dead on the backswing. But if I play them all, I probably just run out the timer, even if I'm playing at a reasonable pace. That's allowed. That is allowed, and you're allowed to do that. Um, but yeah, that's what slow play is defined as in the rules. The next thing, and I think the thing that most of this video will be about, although I don't know how long I will be yapping about it for, is slow play that's not in the rules. So what is this? What does this mean? Um, so let's say the impetus to make this stemmed mostly from when I was talking to one Justin Birch, top 4 at Worlds this year, in the Let's Talk UVS Discord, and he was talking about, well, I was on stream versus Andrew Port. If you haven't watched that game, they ended the match 0-0 draw, which is impressive. And he said, well, I think if, because being on stream, sometimes there's some stuff that comes up that takes some extra time just as part of the stream setup, and you don't really get an extension for that. He's like, well, I think if I had that 1 to 2 extra minutes, I would have gotten there. And I'm like, interesting. And he also said, at the start of each of Drew's turns, he took about 2 to 3 minutes to decide what his first form would be. And I almost cried. That is criminal. Nothing against Andrew Borat. That is criminal. If in so in general, the vast majority of slow play that I have experienced in this game, which again hasn't been too many issues, I have yet to need to call a judge for my opponent in unintentionally playing slowly. But a lot of times, look, we're gonna start. UniVersus is not easy. There is so much going on, pretty much on like any board state. And it can be like, you got to think like, what is the line I have to take? And I don't think anyone's going to be out here like you take 20 seconds and your opponent's like, excuse me, your opponent's like, hey, you're taking too long. The problem arises when if I'm sitting there with my board and my opponent goes to play an attack. Let's say they play an Ice Sword Execution, and I've got 2 foundations with 2 copies in my stage. I've got like 2 incubatings and 2 Aaron sidesteps. And my opponent sits there for 20, 25 seconds, and they're like, which one do I hit? That's okay. I understand that sometimes it is not easy to make these decisions. When it gets to, if my opponent sits there for 30 to 45 seconds, and they're like, what do I do? At that point, I will say, hey, please take a game action. In general, my goal, and I imagine everybody's goal, when they sit down to play a match of UniVersus in a best-of-3 Swiss round at a regional, their goal is to finish a match of UniVersus. I don't think anybody's going in like, oh yeah, I want a 1-0 win, or I want to draw. No, nobody's really sitting down to do that. But sometimes that happens, that's just how it goes. But I think a lot more of these could be avoided if people started going like, if your opponent's taking 30 to 45 seconds, say, hey man, please take a game action. Which is in no way disrespectful. There's nothing in the rules that's like it is unsportsmanlike conduct to tell your opponent to progress the game state. That's in fact the opposite. It is you are encouraged at every point of the way to take game actions to progress the game because we sat down to play a game, And when like round two of Worlds, day two. I was playing against Bailey. I do not. I know he has a double last name, and I don't quite remember what it was. But I believe he was the person who won the Australian regional on Peak, and he was playing Peak for Worlds. And there was a moment where he had like I don't know. I don't remember if it was he was deciding which attack to play, but it was a good 30, 45 seconds, and I was like, hey, I would please take a game action. And he was like, oh yeah, 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 and he took a game action. In other games, I have had moments where, my opponent's thinking, and I say, hey, please take a game action. If 20 to 30 seconds pass and they still haven't taken a game action, I would say just call a judge. I would say, hey man, we've taken a lot of time here. I'm gonna call a judge over for slow play. I don't think, and I think if you also want to be like, hey, I need you to take a game action, like by all means give your opponent all the grace in the world if you think they're not doing it intentionally. There's very much, like I said, UniVersus is a complicated game. It is very fair to need to think sometimes. But there's just you have to sort of balance that with the goal of wanting to finish a match on time. And the problem arises for a lot of people that there's nothing in the rules that says what taking too long to think is. You know? You kind of gotta come up with that yourself. You gotta have that codified in your own self, which is why I love seeing the timer whenever I'm playing Swiss round because I can look at the timer. If I'm sitting there and my opponent is taking like tanking for 5-10 seconds, I can immediately go, all right, I'm gonna give it like 20, 30 seconds, and then I'm gonna say, hey, please take a game action, and I can count that without having to like pull out a pocket watch or whatever. There's there's not really anything in the rules that tells you what it is. You kind of have to define it for yourself. Um, in general, like I've played Rodan in multiple events now, and I have not had any draws in any of those events, I believe. At Louisville or Worlds or any of the webcam events, but that's a different story. Because webcam is its own whole can of worms that I don't want to get into. But, you can play a deck that plays slower and not have the issue of what if I go to time. If you're playing efficiently and your opponent is playing efficiently, then there really should never be any, well, I shouldn't say never. Some of these decks, some of these concoctions that like Corey Nelson and Justin Birch come up with, they certainly do take a while. But in general, vast majority of decks, it should be very rare that you're running out of time. And this is not a call to action for everyone to be an asshole and say, "Hey man, pick up the pace after like 15 seconds." I supremely encourage you to give your opponent as much grace as you can when it comes to this stuff, because in general, the goal is never to be an asshole. And I think that's part of the reason that a lot of people are apprehensive about doing this is because they don't want to be an asshole, which is fair and valid and understandable. But there does come a point where you're like, "Hey man, I want to finish this match on time. And this isn't against you. This isn't against anybody. I just would like to finish a match of UniVersus." Um and I think no one will have any grief with you if they're taking 30 to 45 seconds on a decision and you're say, "Hey man, if you could pick up the pace of play so we could finish this match on time." I don't think anybody's going to be like, "Oh, you fucker, you grr grr ah." Like that's a very fair statement. Um this is honestly about all I got. I think I've already repeated myself like 20 times and there's really only so much to be said here. Uh if you have any thoughts on this, please at me in any of the discords. I love talking about this because it's something that I have a lot of experience with from other games, and coming to this game, it is. Again, I want to say this is not something I've had to do like every game of every event. This is very rare when it comes up. But I do think if you learn to, at the very least, ask your opponent to play faster, it will help you finish more matches, which is always the goal. The goal is never to get a draw. The goal is to finish more matches. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, concerns, comments, Share them with me in the Discords at JetJaguar. You can post them in the comments here too, but I don't get notifications for those, and I do get notifications for Discord. Um, yeah, don't play slowly. Practice your deck more so that you can play faster, and be kind and tell your opponents to play faster if you think they are playing too slowly. But don't be an asshole about it. Thanks, bye.